I always find it perplexing when people claim that the new national populism is a threat to life, liberty, and democracy in Europe. Because the reason I find that perplexing is because there is indeed a threat to life, liberty, and democracy in Europe, but it isn't coming from populism, it's coming from anti-populism. It isn't populists who have been beating, shooting, and maiming protesters in France for the past 6 months, causing scores of them to lose their eyes and to lose limbs. It's anti-populists who are doing that. In fact, it's the anti-populists' number one hero, Emmanuel Macron, who is overseeing this extreme state violence and clampdown on French liberty. It isn't populists who are seeking to overthrow the largest democratic vote in UK history, the vote for Brexit, and in the process threatening to undermine the very principle of the right to vote. It's anti-populists who are doing that. It is anti-populists who, exactly as we have been celebrating the 100th anniversary of women and working class men getting the vote, are trying to block something that was voted for by 8 million women and millions of working class men. It isn't populists who are marching through the streets in their thousands, waving placards mocking the stupidity of ordinary people and demanding that the state unilaterally override these people's democratic wishes. It's anti-populists who are doing that. It isn't populists who immiserated the Greek working classes in order to shore up the reserves of the European Central Bank. It's anti-populists who did that. It isn't populists who have tried to interfere in the programs of democratically elected governments in Hungary and Italy. It's anti-populists. And it isn't populists who have enforced the ideology of Fortress Europe and even paid African mercenaries to imprison and torture African migrants in order to prevent them from coming to Europe. It's anti-populists who did that. If you want to see real, violent, life-threatening racism in Europe today, you shouldn't look at populists, you should look at anti-populists. The real danger in Europe today, in political terms, is anti-populism. The real danger is the shrill, often violent backlash of the technocratic elites against the rise of national populist sentiment. The opponents of populism, whether it's Tony Blair, Emmanuel Macron, the European Union, The Guardian, whoever else it might be, the opponents of populism pose a greater threat, I would say, to democratic politics and to liberty in Europe than populists do. Now, the reason I'm pointing out the violent, illiberal, and anti-democratic nature of anti-populism is not simply to say, your political creed is worse than mine, even though it absolutely is. It is really to get to the root of the populist revolt itself by asking this question. Why has the response to the populist revolt, why has the response to the populist events that Paul mentioned and others too, why has it been so unhinged and so destructive? Why have states used extreme violence against the populist upsurge? Why do the political and cultural elites, I think this is the key question, why do they seem willing to trash democracy itself in order to curtail the populist moment? What is that about? The reaction is important because it reveals, I think, how radical and important and good and positive the populist moment is. The populist moment is often presented as a far-right phenomenon, a resurgence of racist hatred, even as a return of the old politics and hatreds of the 1930s. I think that's nonsense. In reality, the populist upsurge, the populist revolt, consists of ordinary people having a reckoning with the political system. Ordinary people confronting the technocratic system of politics that has existed for a few decades now. Ordinary people seeking out new forms of solidarity, we can see that explicitly in France, and new opportunities to have their voices heard. To some people, especially those who inhabit the political bubble or the academic sphere, any politics that comes from below looks frightening. To these people, decision-making is something that should be done in seminar rooms or committee rooms. When it happens on the street, as it has been in France, or when it happens in pubs, in conversations between Brexit voters, or when it happens in parts of the United Kingdom which politicians had forgotten about and wished didn't exist, When it happens there, they find it terrifying, they find it scary. They have a tendency to see any politics which is popular, and that is what populism means. Populism means politics that appeals to a large number of a section of the populace. They think any politics which is popular is inherently dangerous and prejudiced. I think the opposite is the case. The populist moment, the populist revolt, the populist upsurge is, in my view, very positive. And what it fundamentally does is challenge the insulation of politics from public reckoning and public decision-making. This is a process that has been gathering steam throughout the whole post-war period, the increasing insulation of decision-making from ordinary people. We see that with the institutions of the European Union. We see it with the way in which the judiciary now makes decisions that were traditionally made in a more democratic way. We see it in the rise of quangos. We see increasingly the removal of key political, economic, moral questions from the democratic sphere into a sphere that people like us, ordinary mortals, have very little access to. And the populist moment is people saying, we want to overturn that situation, and we want to be heard, and we want to be taken seriously. It is, in my mind, it's not like the 1930s, which everyone always says. It's more like the 1840s. It really is this unformed, unpredictable, sometimes wonderful, sometimes a bit scary, revolt that is sweeping Europe in many different ways. But the thing that all of these different upsurges have in common is that this is a largely bottom-up phenomenon, ordinary people taking a lead or desiring to take a lead and saying one simple thing: our voices matter as much as yours, and you really ought to listen to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul and Brendan, for that rousing speech. So I'm kind of here as an academic, so I like to define terms and bore people with them. But I think it's good to define populism before we try and tackle the bigger question of whether we should fear it. So in terms of populism, we can say that it's what some people would describe as a thin-centred ideology, which isn't meant to make it sound derogatory. It's just to say that usually we find populism as a host ideology for other ideas. So we see socialism being part of left-wing populist programs in places like Greece, and in Italy we see it in its more right-wing variety. And as Brendan pointed out rightly, a lot of people associate populism with that right-wing type, but we need to be careful in reducing it just to that. It's a wider phenomenon that we're seeing at this present moment. Another thing which Brendan has also kind of demonstrated is the monist nature of populism. By monism, I mean that policy decisions are rooted in the will of the people, and that's the ultimate metric that we should use to measure the validity of democratic decisions. So it's a good thing, this idea of popular sovereignty, but as I'll go on to look at later, there's also a more pragmatic side of democracy that we also have to bear in mind when making public policy decisions, and that might be on grounds which I perhaps differ from other people's opinions. So just to define that is quite useful. Now looking on at my argument, I would say that we shouldn't fear populism per se, because populism has a great potential to reinvigorate our politics and to get people involved from the grassroots upwards. Where my concern lies is in the more illiberal and authoritarian tendencies of the right-wing strain of populism, which I've been studying for the past 5 or so years. This has a potential to erode the very foundations of our democratic order, and to shut out minority viewpoints from debates. We can only look at these tendencies in places like Hungary under Fidesz, and also in Poland under the Law and Justice Party, where institutions around the rule of law, the protection of minorities, and the separation of powers are being deconstructed by authoritarian leaders. So I don't think that populism is a bad thing in itself per se. It should be integrated, and populist demand should be integrated into democratic debates. My work on looking at anti-Islamic forms of protest in the UK, organisations like the EDL and Britain First, suggests that one of the key drivers of these populist movements is a sense of feeling marginalised, feeling silenced and feeling shut out of politics. Now, while populism doesn't have to resort to the extremes of the political spectrum, there is a risk sometimes in this more kind of voluminous kind of form of protest in straying into those more extreme fringes. But I think that the hearts of the people who demonstrate sometimes at these protests have it in the right place, which is making sure that elites listen and notice to their demands and aims, which is a core part of any democratic system. Some people argue that populism is the new normal. If we look at kind of electoral vote shares across Europe, purely from a statistical standpoint, actually it's a very small share of the votes, looking beyond referenda and to the actual representation of these parties. And what we often see, the dilemma of populism, as we perhaps can call it, is that once they've registered on the democratic system, it's where do you go from there? I'm not just talking about right-wing populists, but also left-wing populists. We've seen in Greece the rise of Syriza, but also their conformity to the mainstream after that. So what we must do then is to harness this current populist zeitgeist in order to get people re-involved in politics, and to do it in fresh ways, like citizens' assemblies, deliberative mini-publics and consultations, which ground policy decisions in everyday people's lives and their concerns. There's a challenge for elites in this, but also citizens, as we've seen in this Brexit moment that we're currently in, have also taken up new and radical expressions of democratic activism. And that's not just people on the kind of Remain side, but also, not people just on the Leave side, but also on the Remain side. But the key challenge is how we channel this populism. How do we give it teeth and exercise it in a pragmatic way? And that is at the heart of some of the different faces of democracy. We have the more pragmatic part of how we make collective decisions versus what Margaret Canavan, who's written quite a lot on populism, calls the redemptive face. This idea that democracy can kind of implement the dreams and desires of the people. So should we fear populism? No. It has a capacity to repoliticise those who are underrepresented in our democratic system.
1 minute.
However, we should avoid the illiberal authoritarian version at democracy's peril. Thank you.
Matthias?
Thank you. Should we fear populism? Quoting FDR, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
He continues, by the way, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. So probably fear is the wrong response to populism, especially if it results to hysteria. Because, as my previous speakers have pointed out, to some extent populism is a fact of political life almost. But if we were talking about the currently most prominent form of populism in the West, which I would argue is right-wing populism, there are a few things we should be worried about, I would argue, and I will name two of these, one briefly and the other one maybe in a little more detail. I'm speaking from somebody from a position of academia and from the political left. A response to this, I would argue, threat is, I would suggest a dual strategy of critically looking within ourselves, on the one hand, if we are the defenders of liberal democracy to some extent, while vigorously pushing back against these challenges at the same time. I will spare you the definitions of populism, which William has gratefully already done so. I will talk about two things, media populism and freedom of speech. Media populism, we could define as media coverage in service of populist politics. This includes negative coverage of populist politics, of course, by the so-called mainstream media. It does include media who are promoting populist agendas of various types, and it does also include the attack against the mainstream media by media populist platforms. I'm here talking mainly about platforms such as Breitbart, which I've studied, and also German and Austrian variants. Research suggests that platforms like Breitbart shape electoral outcomes in the previous US presidential election, and that the growing numbers of audiences use these platforms as sources, or their main sources of news even. My research suggests that the anti-media populism on these platforms, so specifically the attack against the mainstream media, yes, mainly targets the main targets, the major media companies, pointing out its hypocrisies and flaws and biases of this so-called professional media. Some of these, and this is the inward part, are legitimate criticisms, by the way. Some of these criticisms continue to be pointed out by media scholars such as myself. The difference is here the conclusion, which is this, to conclude from this that it should turn into utter distrust of the mainstream media. These platforms assert themselves as alternatives or even substitutes for these mainstream media because they're more honest about their biases at least, and thereby are more successful in promoting these partisan truths that these other mainstream media do also promulgate, but hiding them behind their professional standards and so-called objectivity. They're successful if you look at data on trust in news media among Breitbart readers, such as the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, which suggests that only 13% of those readers trust news most of the time. By news, of course, they mean the mainstream part of news. The second point is the fight against political correctness and the claim to protect free speech, which I would like to talk a little bit more about. This claim, first of all, is rarely taken seriously on the left, and is instead usually treated as a justification for incivility, offensiveness, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., rather than an actual principle that these people who make these critiques actually believe in. Before I do take that claim seriously, I do want to point to research which gives some validity to that response, so that it's really about legitimating certain forms of speech. In research done by White and Crandall, this suggests that through a series of survey experiments that they have conducted, that people who hold racial prejudices also tend to defend anti-black remarks, for instance, more than remarks addressed against the police, or anti-police remarks, we could say, than less prejudiced people. We should take this criticism seriously, though, as more than just a carte blanche to be racist, sexist, or homophobic. I should also preface that in the legal sense, freedom of speech is about the freedom of government restriction of speech, and that is also never absolute, not even in the US. But yes, speech is regulated and policed in more informal ways, which I think is the real target or the real issue here. One way language evolves is in recognizing and responding to different forms of discrimination, injustices, and disadvantages over time. This is what is usually called as political correctness. The underlying assumption here is that it's really about conformity to certain views rather than real engagement with issues. We could also view it as anti-discriminatory speech or inclusive speech. I'm actually sure that many of the people who attack PC adhere to many of these norms and probably also do not really want to violate them. Let's say the N-word whenever they feel like it. I think that's actually not the point. The real issue of contention is how these norms are sanctioned and how speech is policed and informally regulated. Should it be through counter speech? Should it be through education and training? Or should it be through various forms of regulation, through laws and policies, let's say platform policies, for instance? So even if it's encountered by speech, though, the question is how. Is the counter speech an insult, or is it, let's say, a more rational pushback? Our refined understanding of the different mechanisms of discrimination, which is, I would argue, still important and useful, this notion of implicit biases or institutional racism, yes, has led to the tendency, however, to quickly dismiss a remark or a person making that remark as racist, sexist, homophobic. I don't think that's very useful. This actually may be even true on some level. There are some unconscious biases which all of us, I would argue, hold. Some might be more conscious of those, some might be more forceful in confronting them. I, for instance, used to be biased against people from the Austrian South, I'm born in Austria, which is the stronghold of the Jörg Haider's FPÖ. I've then met lots of people from the South and kind of changed my mind a little bit. But is calling out somebody really the best response, educationally or strategically? And does that frequent response have consequences, pressures of conformity, which impede or prevents debate or silences participants? I've done a study which suggests that this pressure of conformity is real at the university level in a survey which we conducted at the University of Frankfurt, which is one of the strongholds of the left studentship in Germany, where we basically have found out, I cannot go into this because I'm running out of time, but a majority of students are actually not punitive about offensive speech. They are not intolerant to hear controversial positions at the university, and they are not afraid to speak their minds. But for a considerable portion of them, the opposite is true. They are punitive about offensive speech. They are very much intolerant to hear controversial positions, and they are afraid to speak their minds. I don't have time to get into this, but in conclusion, I would quickly say that we should be concerned with the careless name-calling, such as racism, which is furthering antagonism rather than alleviating those antagonisms, and we should try to kind of really engage in arguments that some of us think we have been having for decades, so therefore we should not reopen these debates. I think there's a real need to reopen these debates. Thank you.
I wanted to say something about political correctness. I think that is part of the populist revolt. I actually agree with your comments on the pushback against political correctness and its kind of flimsiness, or sometimes is not particularly convincing, especially when it comes from magazines like Breitbart and others on the alt-right or the hard right or the internet right, whatever we're calling it. Because what strikes me is that very often those kind of so-called populist publications actually push their own version of political correctness and do also take offense at things that they don't like, whether, Beyonce doing a Black Power dance at the Super Bowl or something, whatever it might be. So I'm often struck by the way in which the culture wars or the media debate is often a conflict between two different versions of political correctness rather than a confrontation with the idea of political correctness, which in my view is a pretty bad idea, which is this notion that the best way to change attitudes and behaviour is to control speech and thought, which I've always thought is actually the worst way to change attitudes and behaviour. But I do think ordinary people's annoyance with political correctness is a key feature of the populist pushback, because I think what people feel is that they have lived for a long time in a culture which basically says to them, you can't say that. You can't be too critical about multiculturalism. You can't be overly critical about Islam, that's Islamophobia. You can't oppose gay marriage, that's homophobic. There are so many things people have been told they cannot think and cannot say, that eventually it just bursts. And I think one of the most extraordinary things about France, which everyone tends to forget, including me, is that 5 years ago, there were massive, massive protests in France against the institutionalization of same-sex marriage, which I think was, thousands of people on the streets, and they were Christians, left-wing people, gay men against gay marriage. Literally thousands, tens of thousands of people. And looking back, I now think of that as a kind of early expression of the Gilets jaunes, which is this frustration that life is being changed without your say-so and without your contribution to the debate, and with you feeling that you haven't really had a say in what's going on. So I do think that the pushback against political correctness is positive when it comes from ordinary people, because it is part of that process of saying, all those things you say we're not allowed to say, we're now going to say them because we believe in open debate.
Thank you very much. William?
I didn't really have. I was wanting to wait for questions from the floor. So.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Matthias, is there anything you want to?
A quick remark about your comments about political correctness just now. It being a bad idea. I think to some extent how these speech and language norms evolve are, I don't want to say natural, because it's human behavior essentially, but natural because that just happens over time. Like we change the ways we talk to each other. I think the real question, I think that's also what your criticism aims at, is how we police those, or how we sanction against violations against these norms. And I think there's different ways to go about it, and I think we are in agreement that there are more and less useful responses to that. Just saying somebody you're wrong, or you're racist, or you're sexist, that's not going to further debate on any level.
Okay, well, I'm going to start with some statements, and then I want to throw you back as a question as to what the panel thinks, because it's the only way I can think to articulate this. See, I'm a little suspicious about all this in terms of populism. I smell a bit of a rat here. I think that this is a safety valve we're seeing in most of these movements in Europe. To some extent with UKIP, to some extent with Front National as it's emerging, as it is now, and in other countries as well. Obviously, I don't know the specifics of every individual country, but there are some topics that these populists would never touch, would never go to, in terms of power relations, in terms of the relationship between the US and Israel, and then the whole issue about Jewish power in terms of and Zionism and all that kind of thing. And in fact, many of these movements are openly Zionist. Tommy Robinson has actually stated that he is a Zionist. So. And Britain First similarly. And another thing, just to link into the fact that this is the direction, that populism is being tamed, populism is being directed in a certain direction. You may be familiar, or some of you may not be familiar, with the case of Alison Chablot, who is a Holocaust skeptic. Now, the criticism that she has had has not only been from the traditional left as well, but from people on the populist right who don't want to touch it. Don't want to touch the fact that her free speech has been affected. Don't want to touch the fact that she's been arrested, that she's been going through a trial, and all the rest of it. And I don't know, maybe Spiked have given her favourable coverage. I don't know. Maybe they haven't just dismissed her as a lunatic. I don't know. But in general, there are. I'm just giving that as one example. The whole Zionist issue.
Too many examples.
Now, what I'm trying to say is, what do the panel think of that? What do the panel think of the fact that it's a safety valve, really?
I want to ask ask William is, I guess, query my understanding of what you said, which I think is sort of a mixture that populism should be harnessed or listened to by the elites, but also, I guess, as per what the gentleman before said, that there was a safety valve element there as well, that in the form of people's courts and citizens' parliaments and this kind of thing. Now, my question is, given that the response of the political elite in France has been police dogs and batons, and in Britain has been to denigrate the ordinary people, denigrate their intelligence, deny the referendum, etc. Is that then, are you saying that that's a mistake by the elites and that they ought to be doing the sort of safety valve stuff that you're talking about? Or does it actually say something more about that things have gone too far? Does it represent some more fundamental antagonism that's going on there?
Anyone else?
Hi. I just wonder why we've mentioned groups like the EDL and Britain First and people like that so many times tonight already when they're not actually very popular. And it feels like an odd term to use.
I just wanted to bring up the fact that, like, political elites using populism as a means to sort of, like, using it beneficially. Talking about the flip side of it, I would argue that, like, Donald Trump's populist policies could be seen as an elite, like a wealthy businessman using populist politics to appeal to the people, but in order to, like, rip them off more. So I was just wondering what the panel thinks about that, like the negative uses of populist politics.
Yeah, thank you for the three presentations. I actually came here to understand what populism is supposed to be. I mean, I feel it is a sort of, it means everything and anything for everybody and for people, and therefore it can be used in many different ways. Personally, I think sometimes it's used not to talk about proto-fascists, because for me, Bolsonaro in Brazil or Trump or Orban are proto-fascist. I mean, I would also summarize Salvini in Italy. If you look at these at certain criteria, if you want, I can give you my criteria for fascism. But I mean, that is some way to avoid to speak about the real issue. And on the other hand, when I think you defined populism in terms of that it's popular politics. And I think, should that not what politics is all about? So is there, if we suddenly talk about populism, then did we have politics before which was not supposed to address what people actually want to happen? So as I said, I'm pretty confused still what populism is actually supposed to be, unless it's a disguise, not to mention proto-fascism with certain parties and governments.
Right, okie doke, I'll take two hands and then come back to the panel.
Okay, thanks. I feel I ought to say, well, confess, I think we're in confessional times. I've spent a lifetime being incredibly unpopular, so, you know, try not to throw anything too heavy before I've finished. But I'm a big fan of populism. I love populism, yeah? Populism to me is people feeling energised by each other. It's people who feel like they've got things in common and want to get together to do something about it. And in today's times, you know, when they've been told not to so often, and told they're not up to it so often, I think it's a fantastic thing. And the Brexit moment for me was the democratic moment of a lifetime. Yeah? It felt to me like for the first time in my adult life, my vote counted for something. I'd lost that feeling. Yeah? And the morning after the referendum, I don't think anyone, Remainer or Leaver or otherwise, was not shocked at the result. It was a shocking result, because we underestimated the populism. I really think we did. It can be a very, very powerful thing. And some of the speakers have said, well, if it is that, how can we maybe give shape to it? Well, I'll be honest with you, I doubt we can. You know, the best thing we can do is hope we're attuned to it and hope we have a voice within it and can take things a little bit the way we want to. But that populism is incredibly strong, and I think it's going to be it's got the potential to be, an earth-shattering movement, if it's given the right conditions.
Okay, thank you very much. And the final hand up.
Do we recognize some forms of populism more easily than others? And is there maybe a risk in us doing so?
Yeah, I mean, populism, safety valve, sorry, Freudian slip there. I mean, it's good to look at the drivers of populism when trying to tackle that, because I think that's what's at stake here. I mean, we have seen more recently this shift in the past 10 years since the financial crisis towards this more populist form of politics. But I think it's broadly symptomatic of a longer trend of parties becoming more centrist and also adhering to this kind of neoliberal pragmatic form of political management, which doesn't have a lot of ideological content and doesn't have a lot to say apart from things like austerity in response to some key economic questions. So I don't think it is a safety valve. I think it's been in the making for quite a while. Whether it's here to stay will be interesting, but it does seem to be the current zeitgeist. On the separate issue of Zionism, and my main research is on the far right, and they've switched from this more broadly anti-Semitic stance, so I'm not lumping populists in with this, towards more anti-Muslim forms of hatred. And part of that platform is to cozy up to communities that might oppose Islam. In terms of that comment by the gentleman in terms of kind of attacks on populists, that's obviously a step too far. What's been quite interesting is that since the Gilets Jaunes protests, there has been an attempt by elites to at least listen to some of the demands of the protesters, and there has been policy responses. But why it took so long for a leader who was originally perhaps seen as a left-wing populist to cotton on to that is slightly bizarre. In terms of, let me see, I would look at the question on kind of the links between populism and fascism. I don't see any repeat of history happening at the moment. I think populism is very different in terms of its drivers, and I wouldn't like to draw those historical parallels because I think they're unhelpful in sort of identifying the more proximate drivers of this populist moment. And ideologically, they're very different as well. Populism divides the political system between the elites and the people, whereas fascism is a more it's what some people term as a palingenesis. So it's this idea of restoring a state from a state of moral decadence or decay. So I think they're kind of, I'd be careful in drawing parallels between populism and more historical forms of far-right mobilizations.
Okay, thank you. Brendan?
On a few of those things, Alison Shablos is not a Holocaust skeptic. She's an anti-Semite who thinks the Holocaust didn't happen. She's just a racist scumbag. However, in terms of whether people have responded to her predicament, Spiked has. We defend her free speech. We defend freedom of speech even for racist scumbags. That's how committed we are to freedom. In relation to the Zionism question, anti-Semitism, anti-Islam. I actually think anti-Muslim bigotry is a growing problem. And I think actually, ironically, it's in many ways a product of the obsession with clamping down on so-called Islamophobia. Because the more that society crushes any open discussion of Islam or extreme Islam or mass immigration or whatever else that people are supposedly not supposed to talk about now, the more I think that energizes a bigotry towards Muslims. Because, if you kind of cut off one section of society or one belief system or one ideology from any kind of open, frank discussion, it's going to intensify people's feeling, and it's going to intensify, in some quarters, I would still say it's a minority, a sense of antagonism towards that community. So the thing I'm increasingly interested in is not only in insisting that there's a difference between Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, which I would insist on. I think Islamophobia is often just criticism of Islam, whereas anti-Muslim bigotry is largely a racialized hatred. Instead of just insisting on a difference between those two things, I'd actually say that they are related. And the more that society forbids any criticism of that religion, the more it might be unwittingly energizing antagonism towards Muslims themselves. In relation to proto-fascists, I just don't see it in those people that you mentioned. They might be Bonapartists or populists or whatever else we might want to call them. But, I really dislike using the word fascist or Nazi for people who aren't fascists or Nazis. So I try to avoid it as much as possible. I'm sure I slip up sometimes. But, the one time I have felt tempted to use the word fascism is when I've been watching thousands of petty bourgeois people in the United Kingdom taken to the streets effectively to rage against the underclass. That's when I have felt ever so slightly tempted to use the word fascist. I still haven't used it. And of course, that's people like the People's Vote Lobby. That is this kind of well-educated, often upper-middle-class section of society who basically look upon the throng as this deeply problematic section of society, who are so stupid that they made this catastrophic decision in 2016 to leave the European Union, and now their vote must be overturned, and their ideas must be crushed, and they must be put back in their box. That's the only time I have felt tempted to use the word fascism over the past couple of years. So I sometimes think, and I'm not talking about you, but I sometimes think anti-populists need to really think carefully before they go throwing the word fascism around at other people. The final point I wanted to make was, I completely agree with the guy at the back about the positive nature of populism. And I really, you say it's about people getting energy of each other. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think populism is fundamentally a search for solidarity. That is why French people have been protesting every weekend for 6 months. People are saying, oh, but what are your demands? Or what do you want? Or, Macron has done this, this, and this. Aren't you happy yet? The point is that the protests themselves are a form of solidarity. It's a physical space in which people can get what they feel they don't get in the kind of neoliberal, atomized, technocratic society in which they and all of us increasingly live, which is a sense of solidarity, a sense of communion, a sense of being in touch with other people. So I think in many ways, the Gilets Jaunes protests every weekend are themselves a kind of form, a manifestation of solidarity. And I think Brexit, the vote for Brexit was about democracy. It's very, very straightforward. If you look at the Lord Ashcroft polls, which were done on the day of the vote itself, the number one reason people gave for voting leave was because they think laws that we live by should be made in the country we live in. That is a central component of democracy, and it has been going back through every single democratic movement in the modern period. If you live under a law, you ought to have some ability to consent to or to challenge that law. The Brexit vote was entirely about democracy, and defending Brexit now from those who would overthrow it is also entirely about democracy, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Thank you. Where to begin? I'll begin in the question in the front, what is populism, maybe again. So, I mean, one of the complications is that it's kind of a catch-all term. But, I mean, there are some kind of commonalities. I mean, the construction of the people is one of these, which is usually on kind of a vertical axis. You know, you could think of it, the people against the elite, but also horizontally against some form of outsiders. And usually there's also kind of an alliance assumed between these elites and these outsiders. Namely, the elites are only there for, well, immigrants or ethnic minorities and these kinds of things, and not here for us, the people, which is usually a rather homogeneous mass of, you know, usually, well, in most cases, when we talk about right-wing populism, white, Christian, native people. I mean, that's one thing I wanted to mention. The energizing nature of populism. I mean, the question always is, but what are the consequences or what are the side effects? If the side effects are, yes, so people are energized, that's certainly a positive outcome of many of these populist movements. And I would also argue, I think you have made a similar argument in your opening remarks, that the most positive thing that I can see is that, from my point of view, the left finally wakes up with a true response to these challenges. That's what I would hope, at least. But I mean, with what side effects? So if the side effects are related to these outsider-insider kind of distinctions, if the consequences are forms of anti-Islamic sentiments, which are, I would argue, being amplified and promoted through many of these movements, that's not a really good outcome, because I think it does further strengthen antagonisms between different people, and it further amplifies this dynamic where people cannot really talk to each other anymore beyond positioning each other on, you have to be on this side of the debate and I am on this side of the debate. That's basically where the debates start. That's not a real debate, of course, and that's a real challenge to go beyond this. I mean, like, if you think about yourself, think about the many debates that you might have been engaged in about politics with others. How quickly did you assume the other person to come from a certain kind of perspective or certain position? That happens very quickly, and I think you have to work very vigorously against that, personally. What else? Well, so the repoliticization through populism. I mean, you've made some remarks in that direction, that it's something that reinvigorates democracy. I would challenge that a little bit, because how does it really repoliticize? Yes, so energy, people feel the need to perhaps re-involve themselves in the democratic process, especially people who have been disenchanted with representative democracy. But I mean, referenda is not the only way to make your voice heard in the democracy. And we're also not living in Athenian times where we kind of get on a square and kind of engage in a direct dialogue. It's always kind of distorted through the media, amongst other things. And the question is, does it really inspire, or does it really further dialogue between people? And I would argue, because of what I just mentioned in terms of antagonism, it does not further dialogue, and I think this is a real problem. So I think both sides, those who call certain people racist very quickly, as well as those sides who inspire those racist sentiments, should kind of put it down a notch and then engage in real dialogue with each other.
Is not the most troubling aspect of populism its tendency towards crass oversimplicity, both are in the concept, its general concept of democracy and also of specific issues, in that it very much tends to simplistic answers to complex questions. And so I'm afraid I've trouble accepting Lord Ashcroft as being the best observer or student of people's responses anyway. But in or out of the EU, Norway's not a member of the EU, so having an agreement identical with Norway would be compliant with the referendum, albeit that the referendum was only consultative, not determinative. But there's been loads of arguments about whether the current May agreement is a betrayal or not, because of speculation about what people meant by voting out. Now, it's a complex issue. The notion that it could be determined, up front like that, it's not undemocratic to say, now there's a specific proposal, let people consider again. That's not a denial of democracy. That's adding more democracy and giving people a more specific issue to discuss. The reduction of things just to voting, democracy is about accommodating a spectrum of views, and reducing everything to a binary issue is a diminution of democracy, not an enhancement of it.
Thanks. My question's really to you, Brendan, I think. I really love your straightforward approach. It's very nice and clear and easy to get a grip of. But I still don't quite understand what we're talking about, in the sense you refer a lot to Gilets jaunes, and you can understand it into rise of Syriza, or in Brexit to a large degree, being populist, people getting together, fighting the elites and so on. I don't quite see the same thing, and I'm interested whether you define it as the same. The Eastern Europe, largely generalising, elections in a fairly passive way for the right wing and extreme right wing, and support for them, not particularly active on the ground, not people getting together and doing stuff. Is that really popular? So that's one of the questions. The other, it's, forgive me if it's straying a bit off populism, but in the sort of general libertarian approach you put forward, I'd like you just to philosophise for a second on how far anti-racism can just be crushing what people want to say, and you sort of squeeze it out of their system one way or another. I'll just put a little bit of context in this. When I've supported football all my life, and in the 70s, the COP, such as it was controlled by the National Front, constant abuse, and through a lot of really great steps in football, actually, it's been driven out to the degree that a guy in a turban can be the referee and sworn at in every way possible, but never called a paki, as in Rochdale they always were, all the time. And so, do you ever countenance a really sort of thorough, oppressive, for want of a better word, anti-racist campaign?
Thanks. The chap that's just spoken there, he said he likes straight talking, so I'll try and give him a little bit more. It started off with what Brendan said when he talked about the anti-populists really trying to pose as the defenders of liberal democracy now, as opposed to populists. But if you actually look at what these people who are supposedly defending their liberal democracy, they openly talk now that it's not a liberal democracy. They're trying to oppose democracy, which they call the tyranny of the majority. It's quite clear. They all openly speak now that democracy is really the tyranny of the majority. So I'm going to address, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, the academic, the chap in the middle. And I have to ask you, why on earth, if you're interested in politics, why are you spending all this time looking at studying the right wing? Because I presume, because you're wanting to study the right wing, you're wanting to look at categories like extremism and tyranny. Well, I'd suggest to you that it's right in your face now. We've had 3 years of absolutely extreme politics from those defenders of so-called liberal democracy. They are now acting tyrannically against the biggest majoritarian vote in this country. So I would suggest that instead of looking at the bogeymen of the right, you ought to look at the bogeymen that we've had 300 or 400 years of. Now, I'm not here to defend the right. I come from decades and decades of being of a radical transformative left, not the wishy-washy Labour left. But I suggest that you're looking in the wrong place, and deliberately so, perhaps. Now, you talked about the right wing being illiberal. And again, if you want to look at who's illiberal, look a little closer to home. Look to the mainstream. Look what's happening all around you. And frankly, you're clearly completely blinded, because I don't like a lot of the politics that's happening in Hungary, and you intimated that neither do you, and that's quite fine. But what you must accept, and that we all must accept, that it's a democratic nation, and everybody's been elected democratically by the demos. Now, if you want to override that because you don't like it, just say so and join the tyranny of the minority who are ruling us now.
So I just kind of wanted to bring one simple idea forward, is that whether we're talking about populists, talking about anti-populists, we're talking about anyone who is putting forward an idea, generally, we are, as human beings, are social animals. We look for validation. So anyone who's going to express any sort of idea wants someone to agree with them. And the more people that agree with them, the more popular that idea becomes. And eventually, people, things, snowballs start rolling, things get moving, and ideas come forward and grow. Now, my question, I guess, it's not, I don't know if it's a question, is when you're looking at, you were talking earlier, I'm sure I forgot your name, about how this the populist movement is a movement led by ordinary people who want to be heard and expressed. While I agree that it's driven and moved by ordinary people who want to be heard and want to feel they come together and they have solidarity and a movement energy, it's often not led by people like that. If you look at Nigel Farage, if you look at Tommy Robinson, if you look at even Corbyn, it's people with an agenda who want to get something moving, and they use the ability to say things that are popular with people to drive that forward. So that was just one thing. So I'm just basically trying to come at it, questioning it from a psychological point of view of why populism is popular and how it's being used to further certain agendas. There was another point, but I forgot. So.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi. I'm James Hartfield, and I'm Brexit Party candidate for Yorkshire and Humber. And anybody wants to come and help me on Saturday, come down to Wakefield, and we'll be canvassing for the Brexit Party. And the reason I'm doing it is because the way I see it, and I thought Will was good on this, about the way that the political debate closed in the 1990s and noughties, and ordinary people were shut out. And like many people, I saw that referendum on the European Union as a key point to reassert the case that we should be making our own laws, that we should be a democracy. And I was very excited by it. I think I was up here at the Leeds Salon one time talking about it. And I was thrilled that we got it through. And like lots of people, we woke up in that glorious morning, the following day, and thought, great, now we're going to have it. And of course, that's the opposite of what happened. We've seen 2.5 years of prevarication and avoidance and denial. And I would say that's why nothing can move on. You can see this whole country is like in a complete wreck, because the people who govern us have kind of set themselves willfully apart from the mass that have made this decision. Maybe the decision would have gone the other way. It's only a few percentage points in it. But then having to put themselves in that position of failing to deliver, it made all the problems that the referendum expressed even more profound, because everybody all around the country is saying they're liars. Mrs. May is a liar. She said like 1,000 times, we'll do this thing, and didn't do it. And they look also at Jeremy Corbyn, who is my MP, by the way, and they say, hang on, what is your position? Because, one set of people you say you're for leaving, another set of people you say you're for remaining. And over time, people hear that, and they become angry, and they could become bitter and demoralised. And that's why I think it's really important that anybody who wants to make sure that these things don't go in a bad direction has got to be stuck in there making sure they go in a good direction. I think it's very positive that we have a movement for democracy in Britain. I think you're right in the sense it's thin. There's a great span of opinion in that movement. But the core proposition seems to be like a really good one that I think anybody should be excited about fighting for, which is Britain should be a democracy, that we should make our own laws here in Britain and see through the result of that referendum.
Thank you. I've been listening very carefully to what everybody's been saying, and I'm just thinking of certain experiences in my own life. A few things, really. When I left school, worked in a steel foundry for 5.5 years, and it was tough work. And I encountered democracy for the first time when I paid my union dues. My vote counted. The only time it didn't count was if it was strike action, because I was an apprentice, and if there was a strike, I was always going to be at work. I wasn't going to be doing anything, so I wasn't allowed to vote. Those men I worked with, and they were nearly all men, because foundry work, working in a steel plant, it was brutal work. Those men were Labour voters. I can't remember any man saying I'm a socialist. The Labour Party abandoned those men years ago, and they've abandoned working class people years ago. Those men now, a lot of them are dead, because they didn't live past 67, some of the older guys. They would be regarded as populists. They really would. I promise you they would. That's one thing. The other thing is, I voted Leave, my wife voted Remain. We haven't fallen out with each other. I think that's really, really important. We voted for different reasons. I agree with Brendan, democracy was one of the key things. I watched what happened with the Greeks in 2015. They were crushed. I think it was 62% of Syriza said no more austerity. Alexis Tsipras went into a meeting, came out 23 hours later, and he was a broken man, and he'd signed away even more of the Greek. Everything. Those people are broken. The Irish, I think in 2011, they were told, we'll give you a bailout, but the Irish people are going to socialise this debt. I was watching all those things when I voted in the referendum, and they really did make my decision. I think it is what's happening, especially with the European Union, is dictatorial. I think finally, populism has been with us for a very, very long time. And I think it's going to stay with us. It's probably been around since democracy started. But I think out of this situation, we can actually get some grassroots sort of politics where the elite politicians or the establishment don't cheer democracy in public and then murder it in private. And I think I'm quoting something from Spike there, and it was very profound and it's very, very true. But I think this is a chance for us to come together with a grassroots, people involved in more democracy, and to make something better, and to hold politicians, put their feet to the fire, to make them responsible.
Yeah.
Well said. Right, let's start with Brendan first.
Yes.
2 more rounds of questions.
I really agree with that last point there completely. And it made me think about a lot of the questions. And one thing that I've constantly thought over the past couple of years is the issue of who are the real extremists, because, I often get called an extremist. Brexit voters in general are often looked upon as extremists. And you want to say, coming back to the point about anti-populists, what's more extreme? Voting to leave the European Union, which we've only been members of since 1993, and then the EEC before that. Is that extremist, or is it extremist to march through the streets of London demanding that the largest vote in British history be overturned? That's, to me, genuine extremism, kind of scary extremism. The People's Vote, I think, is an extremist movement, and a pretty scary extremist movement. Or, Change UK with Chuka Umunna and all those other idiots. That, to me, is an extremist movement, because this is a political movement that is devoted to overthrowing the largest act of democracy in this country's history. That to me is far more extremist than anything I've heard Nigel Farage say or any of the other so-called extremists in the Brexit camp. So I think we really do have to get some perspective on that and look at where the real opposition to democracy and liberty and to ordinary people's right to have a say, where that opposition is really coming from. And I think if we look at that, we might understand where the problems really lie in society at the moment. On a second referendum, the question was asked about how can it be anti-democratic to have a second referendum. I just don't believe people when they say this anymore. I've stopped believing people who say, how can this be anti-democratic? It is so obviously anti-democratic. It is so obviously anti-democratic to have a vote, to never enact the result, and then to make people vote again. There's your problem right there. It would be like Barack Obama being elected in 2008, and he's never allowed to go to the White House, he's never allowed to make any laws, he's never allowed to make any decisions because a small section of the elite decide he's unfit for office, he's not going to be a good president, we don't like him. And then you force people to vote again before the man they voted for has ever taken office. That's what it would be like. Now, anyone who says that that's not anti-democratic, they are kidding themselves, and they know they are kidding themselves. I really don't believe it anymore. If you engage the populace in the largest act of democracy in this nation's history and you don't enact the result and then make them vote again, that is the living, breathing definition of anti-democracy. So that's the end of that discussion, I hope. And the other point I wanted to make was just on the kind of left-right thing. You know, one thing that frustrates me, I actually think the left-right divide is pretty meaningless these days. It doesn't really stack up. It's not, I don't think it's the defining divide of our era in the way it might have been 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. I think there are more interesting divides now between populists and elitists, or between people who are interested in defending the nation state and people who are interested in a kind of phony cosmopolitanism and globalism and so on. So there are more interesting divides. But having said that, I really dislike the idea that the vote for Brexit is some kind of right-wing thing. And this has become a second-nature view among anti-populists and the broadsheet media and the political class. They just look upon the vote for Brexit as a right-wing phenomenon. That's just their instinctive understanding of it, which is completely and utterly wrong. You know, the key opponents of European integration, going back into the 1970s, tended to come from the left. You know, there's a brilliant video of Barbara Castle giving a speech at Oxford University in 1975 in which she uses all these phrases that I wish I had thought of. She describes the European project as Euro-jingoism. She says it shunts out the rest of the world. It treats Africa and Asia like they are meaningless. And it also undermines Britain's right to make sovereign decisions about trade and its economy and so on. Barbara Castle, Peter Shaw, Tony Benn, Michael Foot, huge figures on the Labour left were actually the most articulate opponents of the so-called European project. And it tended, in those days, to be the right who were the most favourable of European integration. So how this shift has come about, where now it's suddenly deemed to be a left-wing thing to love the European Union and a right-wing thing to oppose the European Union, that to me is a bit of a mystery. But however it came about, I just know for a fact that it's completely wrong. And there are huge numbers of working class voters and left-leaning voters and traditional Labour voters who voted for Brexit because they believe in democracy and because they believe that ordinary people or working people or everyday people, whatever we want to refer to them as, ought to have as great a say in the democratic process as experts and bureaucrats and lords and all these other people who presume to know better than them. So the point I would make in relation to this is we really have to challenge the narrative around Brexit. We have to challenge the idea that it's extremist, challenge the idea that it's this far-right phenomenon, challenge the idea that it's this kind of destabilizing thing, and start to reclaim the narrative that it's actually a very positive, very, very sensible, incredibly rational vote by a huge number of people to reclaim our democratic rights. That's the story of Brexit, as far as I'm concerned.
I would like to comment on something that has been actually addressed at William. But first, the need to scrutinize everything, including the extreme right, whatever that may be, or the far right. So I think this is actually really important, and I would like to push back against that. If we're talking about a movement, and I mean, to some extent, Brexit was a movement, and I mean, a lot of these populist tendencies are movements. They're not usually dominated by a party and their kind of voters who have existed for decades. So those cleavages don't exist anymore. So these movements are a little bit more dispersed, heterogeneous to some extent. They're flexible, they're networked because they have been risen from the internet age, basically. And I mean, what some of these political leaders do very successfully is, of course, through dog whistling and other strategies, is kind of taking everybody into this movement and feeling part of it, and then evoking certain decisions so that people gather around a certain issue and then vote in the referendum a certain way. I don't want to get too far in the Brexit debate because it's not, I've only been here for a year and I'm still an outsider, but maybe my outsider perspective is in some way useful. I mean, this dog whistling is very concerning. Of course, because the right-wing populist party in my country, Austria, has been doing that very successfully by kind of sending out these ambiguous signals, which the liberal media elite usually took as racist. You know, this is clearly anti-Semitic, and this is a clearly, you know, this and that symbol, and what they have been doing with this. Ruth Wodak calls this the politics of denial. They always said, like, well, no, we didn't mean it that way. But of course, some of their supporters did very much understand it in that way. And that has introduced some people from the political fringes as part of that movement very successfully. And I think that's happening. And I think this is, on some level, concerning. On the other hand, there's actually some advantages to include the political fringes into a movement. I mean, in my home country, my favorite, possibly unfair comparison is between Austria and Germany. Austria has a very strong kind of right-wing party that I'm not agreeing on any level. I just want to put that out there. It's been very strong for at least 3 decades. And there has not been a lot of right-wing violence in Austria, for instance. Germany, on the other hand, there have been right-wing parties which came and went. The AfD is the most successful in the post-war era, I would argue, and we will see what happens to that. But in Germany, those voices were much more muted to some extent. And also, and there might be a connection, there might not be a connection. That's a big research question right there. But in Germany, there was a lot of racial violence in the last decades. A lot of burning asylum seekers' homes and so on. Not so much in Austria. So I'm just suggesting that inclusion has some advantages. The difference between populist leaders and their followers. So the expectation on populist leaders is usually to be a charismatic leader, to represent a strong leader, and of course that inherently comes with a kind of, in some way, distance between those leaders and their followers, and that is something that I think should be pointed out. I actually wanted to follow up something that you've already wanted to follow up on this in the second round. Your criticism against anti-Brexit protests. I took you as a defender of free speech. These protests are a form of public speech, which is legitimate, I think. I mean, the question is, what do you express in that speech, and how do you address your opponents? I mean, I don't know how. I mean, there might be different forms of oppression. Some people might call Brexiteers, I don't know, stupid or whatever, primitive. That might, I don't know, but. In general, as a form of expression, I think this should be valued.
So, looking at the charge about why study the right wing, it's mainly because, and I have to say, I look at responses to mainly right-wing extremist form of politics, is because my question really in my mind is, why do people have to, and I'm not lumping in probably populist parties here, but why people have to resort to those outside of the mainstream in order to get represented. So my main concern is just to have a look at why that happens and how it can be addressed in the political system. In terms of the tendency to oversimplification, I think that perhaps is a risk of populism, but populists often ask the right questions. So they might not have the answers broadly. I'm not just talking about Brexit, treading on eggshells here. But there's nothing wrong with asking the right questions, being indignant about something, and that doesn't mean you have to subscribe to a particular form of politics. It might be something around austerity affecting your local community, or it could be some of these broader questions around Europeanisation as well. So I think there is a risk of oversimplification, but it's probably asking some of the right questions that need to be responded to. I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Hi. Yeah, there seems to be been a lot of talk about the sort of right-wing aspects of populism. So there's things about people's concerns about immigration being suppressed, sort of discussion of Islam, things like that. In my opinion, that seems to be one side of the sort of ongoing culture wars, and the establishment is firmly on one side of the culture wars. Witness, the recent knee-jerk sacking of Roger Scruton from his government post. But I'd just like to say something about sort of the other side of population. I think a lot of the populism that's sweeping Europe can be traced back to the financial crisis, 2008. We had the implementation of austerity. We had criminal behaviour by bankers that went completely unpunished. We had round after round of quantitative easing, which propped up asset prices, and that entirely benefits people with assets already, entirely at detriment of people without assets. And maybe that's sort of the other side of the coin. We seem to be coming at this from two angles. We've got the right-wing populism, also got the left-wing populism, and the root of that, in my opinion, is this financial crisis that we've never addressed. Bankers were never punished, nothing ever changed, everyone kept their bonuses, and maybe they've left it too late. Should we fear populism? Well, the establishment should fear it, because if they don't fear it, they're not going to change, they're not going to do anything. Maybe they've left it too late. Iceland, had a completely different reaction to the financial crisis. They did jail a lot of the bankers. They changed their politics quite a lot in the immediate aftermath of it. Maybe we should have done the same, and maybe it's too late to do anything about this wave sweeping Europe now.
I'm sort of still quite baffled about what's meant by populism, and I run a group called Revers of Leeds, which is a Brexit group in Leeds, and I'm in touch with Brexit groups right across the north in particular, and what strikes me is how very tame it is. There's massive anger, don't kid yourself, there's massive anger. We're piling on numbers all the time. There's a hell of a lot of debate goes on all the time on my Facebook group. But what struck me recently is how very much it's been about how to vote in the local elections, and then it's how to vote in the European elections. And so when you think populism, you imagine the Gilets jaunes. I look at the tear gas and the riot police in France, and the torching of refugee centres in Germany and Sweden, and I read in Italy on occasion when some villagers or townspeople went into a block of flats which had been decked out for immigrants, and they went in and took every stickers, furniture out and set light to it. These are just things which just would not happen in Britain, and I find I've got lots of yellow vests in my group. They never actually do anything. You know, there's lots of talk about blocking roads and stopping the city and storming the BBC. But in the end, it shakes down to, well, should we vote Tory in the next election, the local elections, or should we spoil our ballot papers? And I just think it's incredibly mainstream. I don't know what is meant really by populism. I'm more baffled than ever.
I'm just thinking if whether or not populism is a dirty word, whether we like it or not. I'll tell you what I mean on this one. I was at a conference the other week speaking to a clever girl from Oxford, and she said to me she set up a free speech society. But she wouldn't call it a free speech society, she called it a free discourse society, because discourse implies interaction, whereas speech is, commonly assumed with the right. Do us on the left have to be a bit more savvy with how we describe ourselves? Because I probably wouldn't call myself a populist, but I like populism. To answer my own question, maybe it's popular politics rather than populism.
I wanted to pick up on the point about asking the right questions, which I thought was quite a good one, and I think it's brought home quite well with the rise and fall of UKIP. And we had a situation where UKIP support grew significantly over a period of years because they were asking the right questions. And they didn't necessarily have all the answers to it, but people were attracted to that party in a kind of populist manner. But then come the referendum and the vote out, UKIP disappeared because there was now a mainstream party that was reflecting people's views. And I think that kind of asking the right questions and listening to people is really fundamental to it.
Thank you to both speakers who actually responded to my humble input before. It actually made me feel really good, that somebody listens and then actually comes back with something, as indeed everybody's input tonight. I think it's great to be able to hear so many different opinions. I don't think we all ought to be listening to our opinions the same as ours all the time. I think it's very dangerous. And I think we've all got a lot to learn, hearing such a great level debate. So thank you for everybody coming out. It's been really interesting listening. My ears pricked up to the gentleman who said, OK, you're a fan of populism, that's fine, but what about the unintended consequences? And it made me want to stand up again and say, actually, I think I'm more into the intended consequences. Because if you look back through history, anybody who ever wanted to fight for anything, and I'm sure it's the kind of things that probably all of us would agree on. If you look at, say, the Chartists and the Levellers and the suffragettes who wanted women's rights, or slavery anti-abolitionists or anything like that, or even the Long March for LGBT rights or anything else, against Section 28 and everything else, all of them at some point could have been termed populists. And I'm sure that for every one of those situations, there were sort of middle-class people up on the balconies looking down their noses at them, and they were probably calling them things like a rabble, and they were probably saying they were low information, and they were probably pointing out to each other, oh look, the apostrophe's in the wrong place on the placard, this thick ignorant lot can't even spell properly. Yeah? So this populism, is actually the genesis of anything that's worth fighting for anywhere. And I urge everybody, right in the first instance, to appreciate its potential.
Yeah, I'd like to show a bit of sympathy for some Remainers, actually, just to show that I'm not being completely hardline on everything, particularly the students, because I think there's so many pressures on students to conform in all kinds of ways. It's even written into not only student unions, but also the university. But here's my point. There's a sense, I think, amongst a certain kind of student Remainer that the EU is this kind of almost, that this mother's breast that sort of nurtures them, and that the outside world, leaving for some kind of national self-determination is a scary thing. A bit like leaving home for the first time is a scary thing, and having to assert yourself. And there's so many pressures just to conform on the student. I think there's some relationship between that kind of dependency intellectual dependency that we've created in a certain type of student and the kind of psyche of Remainer. And I think, should we fear populism? Well, I can see why, if students have been raised in that particular way, I'm not being patronising, I hope, but why they would fear what they think of as populism. And also they don't want to feel as though they're being racist or feel as though they're being Islamophobic, and there's all that pressure bearing down on them. And I can see how they get into that psychology and why they'd be on that march down in London trying to overturn a popular vote like that. Because there's just so many psychological pressures at work, I think. And I think that's part of the story. So even if they shouldn't fear these changes, I think we have to have some empathy and dialogue, because I think I can understand why they would, and it's also the way that the upbringing is and everything else, and the limitations on their freedoms anyway as a student.
Yes, I want to use this opportunity first to respond to what you said. I didn't say history repeats itself, but Mark Twain said it may not repeat, but it may rhyme. And so in terms of fascism, I had a lot of discussions with my father, and how he and his family moved from being Labour voters in Germany to be supporters of then fascism. And I must say, I never understood him. Nowadays, I understand him quite well when he described the situation. And I think we are again in a phase where there is a lot of political and economic upheaval, and people are not very honest, especially politicians and leaders, about what is happening. And so a lot of problems are disguised or distorted. And I just want to use the example of, is it Mr. William, about the European referendum in the UK. For me, 72% of 52 is 38, so it was never a majority of the British electorate who voted for Leave. So, I mean, that is never mentioned in the discourse on TV or any. It was a consultative vote, not a referendum, and Switzerland conducts referendum, and it said in the conditions and how many people need to participate, that all was not the case. Finally, should there be more democracy at the doctor than in real politics? If I go to the doctor and tomorrow the situation has changed, I'm allowed to vote again and have another say. So, I mean, a lot of things were not told during the referendum and before the referendum, and so it's really strange for me to hear that, you are not allowed to have another vote, even that we didn't tell you the truth. We told you half-truths and and even lies. So, and I think that contributes to the whole situation which you decide to call populism. I still don't understand the term, because if somebody like Jeremy Corbyn is called a populist, and Trump is called a populist, and Trump is clearly a member of the elite, and his supporters, Koch brothers and Mercer, all the billionaires are also part of the elite. So being anti-elitist in terms of saying that is what populism is about, again, doesn't make any sense to me. So again, I come back to the term, and I didn't say they are fascist, I said they are proto-fascist. And I think when we are not in the 40s in Germany, or we are in the 20s, and there, if you want to make a comparison, and again, as I said, there were lots of lies and lots of distortions of what is happening, and the same we are experiencing today. Sort of, some call it framing, sort of cutting off certain parts of the reality and telling only the other part in order to sort of get supporters to support your cause. Thank you.
Right. Okay, so this is our final round also.
Yep.
All right. I wanted to say one more thing about the movement and the difficulty of a movement. The problem with the movement is it includes various types of groups and actors, and it includes the uncomfortable reality to be affiliated with all of those if members of those movements want it or not. That's one thing I wanted to say. I have to say one thing about Brexit, though. I think comparing the Brexit referendum and the decision with other kinds of decisions like putting somebody in office, I think that's not really a fair comparison, because electing somebody for office, you don't, I mean, they make promises, yes, and they sometimes fulfill these promises and sometimes they don't fulfill these promises. It's the nature of representative democracy usually. But a vote on something as complicated, seemingly, because they can't figure it out, as Brexit, because yes, so the general, we want to leave the European Union, okay, fine, that's pretty easy. But like how exactly? And how exactly to even start an unprecedented process like this? How should this come down? Like, what are the actual conditions of, I mean, it's super complicated. So I don't really understand why this is clear cut and, yeah, of course. What else? Since it's the last round, I wanted to make sure that I get 3 messages across. First of all, I already mentioned this. 3 suggestions on how to kind of lead debates, to go beyond positioning. I already said that. A second point, which I haven't made yet, is, and I think which is often a problem in public debates and private debates possibly these days also, is to kind of go beyond insinuating intentions. In other words, to assume where somebody's coming from, why somebody acted or said this or that. It must be motivated by this. I think this is really another dangerous dynamic. And the other thing is, I think we should be careful a bit with different kinds of slippery slope arguments. If we're talking about freedom of speech, for instance, various forms of regulation of online speech and the restriction of hate speech. The argument is always made that, if we start this will start a process of utter unfreedom. And, well, I mean, that's an open question. The other thing is no platforming. The idea here is, if we give a platform to somebody who holds some kind of uncomfortable and nonconformist view, this will lead to this idea spreading like a virus, basically. I mean, that's also a slippery slope argument, and I think both of these are not very useful. All right, I think I'll leave it at that.
So, I mean, in terms of alliances between fascism and populism, again, I can't really see the parallels. I mean, there might be some broad structures, but as a social scientist, I think it's always good to look at the specifics of the situation. In terms of closing remarks, I think what I would term as the promise of populism is something we can all learn from, whether we're on a certain side of the debate or not. I think, but what's constant throughout democracy is this tension between what we see as the pragmatic face and the redemptive face. And so when there is populist kind of movements, I think it's good to think about structures and how it can be harnessed. And I mean, obviously, we're seeing that formalising more concretely in terms of the Brexit debate. But I think it's good to kind of to think about how it can be harnessed. So that's kind of my challenge that I'd end on.
I'm kind of getting slightly tired of this argument that it's really complicated as to what to do next. It's really, really simple. We just leave the European Union. I mean, it is utterly, utterly uncomplicated. We leave the European Union, which means leaving all the institutions of the European Union, which in one way or another hamper our ability to make sovereign decisions. That's the European Court of Justice, that's the single market, and that's the customs union. All those 3 institutions prevent nation states, supposedly democratic nation states, from making sovereign decisions. I mean, it is so uncomplicated. But the thing is, I agree with you that the referendum was different to just electing a leader. in the sense that it was different in the sense that it's even more important that the result is enacted, because it was such a huge, and I'm not saying it's not important that electing a leader is enacted, that's important too, but it's even more important because it was a huge constitutional decision that was entrusted to the people, so the political class outsourced its sovereignty to us and said that what we decided would be enacted. They said, here you go, for the first time ever, basically, in the United Kingdom, we're giving you an enormous constitutional issue to decide upon, and we will do what you say. If they backtrack on that now, sometimes I think people don't understand the gravity of the situation we're in at the moment, which is that if this vote doesn't happen, that's the end of democracy in this country. I know that sounds melodramatic, but to me it seems completely true. That if the first time in the 100 years since men and women have had the franchise, or 90 years if you include women under the age of 30, if the first time in that period that a huge constitutional decision that was outsourced to us is not followed through, then the period of the franchise becomes a joke, and it has no meaning whatsoever. And I think it would be entirely reasonable for people to lose faith in politics and democracy, and that's why it's so important to defend Brexit and to make sure it happens. In my mind, this is the most important issue of our era in any part of the Western world. I think it's that serious. I just want to end. Someone mentioned the Chartists, and I think it's absolutely true. The things that are being said about Brexit voters today, the exact same things were said about the Chartists in the 1840s. The Chartists were the people who campaigned for the right of working class men to vote. The exact same things were said about them, which is that they were susceptible to demagoguery, that they lacked the education in order to be able to withstand the pressures of demagogues or the influence of faction, that they wouldn't quite understand what they were voting for. All the exact same arguments that are now made about allegedly stupid Brexit voters were made about the Chartists. And I always loved their response. In one of their newspapers, which they used to sell on the streets, they had a piece saying, look, we're not saying that working men are just as good as lords and bureaucrats and ladies and everyone else and priests at making political decisions. We're saying they're better. And they're better because they live in society in a way that those people often don't. And I think that's truer now than it ever has been. Working people live in society, really experience it every day in a way that the new political class often doesn't. And that's the kind of confidence we need to go ahead with. We are better at making political decisions than them. And I think that's the argument we need to take into the local elections, the EU elections, and every election in the next few years.
Thank you to our speakers.